Okay, today's lecture is about how World War II changed the United States and the world. And hopefully you recognize this. It's a picture of D-Day. The World War II was so influential that there are many things we could say that trace it back to World War II. But today we're going to be talking about how the U.S. Became dominant in the world and the ongoing conflict in the Middle East that can be traced back to World War II. Also, the effect it had on the U.S. economy, and then on the civil rights movement. Okay, so to start with, and this is where I'd like you to take a few notes. You don't have to write everything down that I say, but just have some bullet points down that, some key phrases. So, foreign policy post World War II. After World War II, the United States, for the first time, becomes a real superpower. It had an influence in World War I, but not much of one. We joined late, and there were other countries that were bigger and more powerful than we. But at the end of World War II, as we know, it ended with Truman using the bomb, and the fact that we created this disastrous weapon, with so powerful, that also, helped make us become more of a superpower, a force to be reckoned with. The other thing is, once Truman dropped the bomb, he really did it partly not just to try to end the war quickly, but also to show Stalin who was boss, kind of, the fact that he felt like Stalin was not to be trusted. FDR had a better relationship with Stalin, who was, by all accounts, a vicious dictator and a really cruel man. However, the enemy of our enemy is our friend. So we had made an alliance, as had Winston Churchill, with Stalin to try to defeat Hitler, who seemed the greater evil at the time. And so that was successful in Europe. But after the European part of the war was over, and FDR dies, Truman is left to try to figure out how to end the war. And he wanted the Soviet Union to know that the United States had developed this weapon. Very soon after the end of the war, the USSR also develops their own atomic bomb, as do some of the other victors of the war. Many of the countries that still today have those weapons are countries that were fighting during World War II. So this leads the fact that the U.S. is a superpower, and that we have this weapon, and that the Soviet Union then has this weapon. And then the other part that's happened here is the Soviet Union has extended themselves. Stalin has taken over, if you can see on this burgundy part of the map, has taken over much of Eastern Europe. During both World War I and World War II, the highest casualties, the highest number of deaths were in the USSR. And they felt like, we do not want to have a European war decimate us again. They lost a quarter of their population in World War II. And so they took over, or Stalin took over, much of Eastern Europe, Poland, half of Germany, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Albania, all sorts of places. Ukraine, all those places came under USSR, and were forced to become communist. So the fact that both of these two countries have this weaponry, and then that they have these rival economic systems, is what is the basis of what's called the Cold War. It starts around 1946 and it goes till 1990. It's a very long, involved, not hot conflict, meaning they don't ever get into fights with each other directly, but fights for domination around the world. So some people describe the Cold War as a fight between Soviet communism and U.S. democracy, but really it was more Soviet communism versus U.S. capitalism. Or it was more an economic system that we had, because we ended up supporting some fairly brutal dictators and who were not democratic at all, just because we wanted to have our corporations and to have them not be communist. So between the Soviet Union and the US, they kind of divide the world up into these rival spheres. You can see all the blue is sort of aligned with the US, and the red is aligned with the Soviet Union. At this time, China is also communist, or becomes communist by 1949. And obviously that's a huge country, but they don't align themselves with the Soviet Union. Mao Zedong, who was the leader of China, and Stalin did not see eye to eye. So China's kind of left on its own. But some of the conflicts that you've probably heard about that are related to the Cold War are the Korean War, Vietnam War, conflicts in Africa. Some of them, there's still some of the effects of those today. Angola was one, and there were many others. Um, conflicts in Central America, and that led, some of the conflicts there led to some of the unrest that's still there in that region, why people are fleeing that region. The Cuban Missile Crisis, and then the Iranian conflict. We are still enemies with Iran today for some of the stuff that we did during the Cold War. So our role, the US role during the Cold War, was to support any anti-communist dictators. For example, the Shah in Iran. The Shah is a title. And then also to support any US corporate interests that are corporations that are trying to do business in different parts of the world. So in Central America, it was United Fruit. In Iran, it was Shell Oil. All of that, our support for really sometimes some really brutal dictators, and our insistence that US corporations have full access to other countries, bred conflict and civil wars and a lot of resentment in the developing world. These conflicts were mostly happening in what was called the third world at that time, but these days it's called the developing world, and it's sort of it's a lot of the countries in the southern hemisphere. Okay, so that was one part of foreign policy. The second part of the foreign policy that results from World War II is in the Middle East. So after the Holocaust had killed 2/3 of the Jewish population, this idea that had been around prior to this of Zionism gained sympathy. So Zionism is the idea that the Jews who have been persecuted from place to place ever since they were expelled from what is now Israel, ever since they were expelled from this by the Egyptians and then others, they have wandered around the world and been persecuted. And many had lived in Europe and had faced anti-Semitism and persecution there for hundreds of years. So there's this idea of like the Jews need their own homeland where they will be the majority and they will not be persecuted again. And that idea gained sympathy given the Holocaust, particularly with the US and the UK, and then a newly formed UN, which had just, it got created in 1946, right after the end of World War II. And those three basically designate this territory here, which had been Palestine, even though it wasn't officially a country, it had been under British mandate ever since those two supposed diplomats from France and the UK, Sykes and Picot, had divided up the Middle East on, between France and UK. Ever since then, this part of the Middle East had been under British control, and so they decide, yeah, we can give that to Israel, and that's what they do in 1948. That land goes to Israel, but no one really consulted the Palestinians who had been living there. I think part of that was that Palestinians typically were herders at that time. A lot of them moved from place to place. They had settlements, but they didn't have like towns and cities. And so it wasn't considered like private property in the same way that a European would look at it. And so it's this sort of imperialist European mindset of, well, that doesn't look like what we consider private property, that you'd have property rights, so we can definitely give that away. And that's what they did. This has led to ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict. All the countries that are around Israel here Israel's in white, originally just hated Israel, and many of them still do. They hated the idea that Europeans basically and Americans, like kind of what's sometimes called the Western world, had just plopped this country in the middle of the Middle East without consulting anyone. And it forced, when Israel was created, it forced a lot of the people who had been living there as Palestinians to move in, and they still live as refugees in some of the surrounding countries of Jordan and Syria and Lebanon. And for those reasons, there's been a lot of hostility about the US being a strong ally for Israel, and then feeling like the US and the Western world has interfered too often in the Middle East. You can see in this map down at the bottom that originally Palestine was all the green, and then they were given a smaller part and a smaller part and a smaller part. And these days it's just what's called Gaza, and little parts of what was supposed to be entirely Palestinian, the West Bank. Um, this conflict has not stopped since 1946, and it has fueled a lot of the anger in the Middle East period against the Western world, and particularly the US. And it allowed, it's not like it's the one reason for it, but it allowed groups like Al Qaeda, which originally come from Saudi Arabia, to get created because they feel like we've got to fight back. This is, again, just US imperialism. All right, that's the two foreign policy sides. And if you wanted to take a break, this is a good time to take a break, and then you can come back and do the last two. But I'm going to keep going. Okay, so the other part, and this is now domestically what happens within the US country, that our economy boomed after World War II. The war had left industrialized nations like England and France and much of Europe in total ruins. Every country there had been bombed multiple times. Japan had been an industrialized country, also bombed. And this meant that the US is like the last man standing. It's the only one that still has factories standing, and they become the industrial engine for the world. At this time, something called the Marshall Plan is created, and it's brilliant, at least for the US, in that the idea behind it is the US will give you money to other countries, and then if they use that money to buy US products, because the only people making any products was the US right then. So the United States is sometimes what's called double dipping. It's getting the money for the loans, the interest on the loans, because all these countries have to pay back that money with interest. And it's also getting their products sold. So, it's a double boon for the US. So also what happens after the war is men come home, women are happy to see them, they get together, babies get born. So basically from about 46 through early 60s is what's considered the baby boom. About that time period, about 15-year time period. And it is the largest population boom ever in US history. And then that's part of what creates also this 1950s economic boom where, people, one thing about having babies is you've got to buy a lot of stuff. So there's a lot of consumerism going on. And there's people competing, or factories competing for workers. So they are offering higher wages and better benefits. This is where things like, we'll provide you health insurance, and it gets tied to work, to your job, which ends up not being very smart during something like what we're going through now, the coronavirus pandemic, given that you lose your job, you lose your insurance. But at that time, that was one of the things that corporations and other companies would dangle for workers to lure them in. And so this was a time of actually the best economic equality that we've had since the Industrial Revolution. Also at this time, all these soldiers coming back, sometimes called GIs, General Infantries, there's something called the GI Bill that's created, and that offers benefits to any veterans, like we'll pay for college or job training, and we'll give you a mortgage with really low interest so you can buy a home. And it allows, there were so many soldiers coming home that could take advantage of these benefits that many people who might not have had access to education and a good job and might not have had access to starting their own company or owning their home now could, as a result of the GI Bill. And that also contributes to that economic equality that is happening more at this time than any other. It also, all this is contributing to the US consumerism, which this is when people really start to just buy stuff. And we've never stopped. And even though wages have not gone up, they've kind of plateaued, and workers are still working hard. People still want to buy stuff, and now we do that on credit. Often we go into debt to buy more and more stuff, but that's a separate problem. All right, the other part that's going on with the economy and just the social influence of it is the 1950s is a time of very constrictive gender roles. Because men were earning pretty good salaries right off the bat, they were considered the breadwinners. It was very easy for a family to live off one salary at that point. That's no longer the case for working class and middle class even now in the US, but it used to be, it'd be pretty easy for a family. If one person had a job, if the man had a job, then no one else had to work. Women had been working, of course, during World War II, Rosie the Riveter, but they had left the factories now and they became housewives. A lot of them kind of that wasn't really voluntary on their part. They had liked the freedom, economic freedom of having their own job and earning their own wages, but they're kind of pushed back into the kitchen and they feel a little bit constrained. And you can see the ad up above of this woman like falling in love with her box of Tide. This is like the kind of advertising that was happening at the time to tell women, all right, your whole life is going to be about appliances. Um, Not surprisingly, this leads to the women's liberation movement. There are a lot of women who really resent the treatment that they have in the 1950s and feel too constrained by the kind of norms of the time, the gender norms of the time, and they end up rebelling in the next decades. And this is our last one. The civil rights movement is something else that I think can be traced back to World War II. Immediately following the end of World War II, Truman desegregated the US military. That was something I'm not sure everybody even realizes, that all through World War II, white men had their troops, and then the African Americans had theirs. You were not integrated. After World War II, Truman feels like that's sort of a shameful relic of a racist past, and so he desegregates the U.S. military forever after. However, African American soldiers who come home from the war, they find that now that they're back in the U.S., even though here they were fighting for their country, they're still not considered as citizens. The system of Jim Crow is in place, particularly in the South. And we'll be talking about Jim Crow, but if that is an unfamiliar term to you, I would suggest you look it up just to make sure that you know what that is. And we will be coming back to it, but not today. And the other thing is, even though the GI Bill had been created, it didn't help African American soldiers very much, because most universities wouldn't accept non-white students. So it didn't matter if you could get your college paid for, no college accepted you. Historically Black colleges and universities, the HBCUs, had taken as many people as they could in, but there were many more who had this money now that they could have gone and got an education had they been allowed to enroll in any of the universities. And then the other thing is, and this is a familiar concept to some, but there was something called redlining at the time. So one of the benefits for the GI Bill was you could get these low interest mortgages and you could buy a home. And banks denied mortgages to Black families. They felt this sort of racist policy had been embedded in the U.S. housing system ever since the 30s, and maybe even before that. But when a lot of African Americans in the 40s fled the South and moved to other parts of the country to get away from Jim Crow, they encountered other racist policies like redlining. In, say, Chicago was a famous city for that, and really all the northern cities did it. And finally, for all this, they come home in the mid 40s and the 50s. By the end of the mid 50s, there has been such a build of resentment, and just like, we're not going to put up with this anymore. And so they start to fight for equal rights, and the civil rights movement is born. It's often dated from about 1954 on, and it goes through the 60s, and we'll be getting to that. But I know many people have thought of heard the civil rights movement, and really you can trace it back to World War II. That picture on the right is just Martin, Washington, where MLK spoke, and sort of you can see what they're saying. Here's what we're asking for. Here's what we're demanding. All right, so that's the lecture, and then I will post on Google Classroom what the assignment is.